It's really a great honor to welcome Brian Eno today on the IMD campus. We're really delighted to have such a creative person in many ways to be with us. And we're going to dive into what is transformative about creativity and what are the various forms of creativity. So Brian, great to have you. I must admit, you're a very difficult person to categorize. You know, we're professors, people are doctors. We could call you a musician, we could call you a producer, we could call you an activist, we could call you a sustainability specialist, we could call you a visual artist, and so on and so on and so forth. So very difficult to position. I guess this is by design. So my first question is, why and what are you looking for?
Yeah, it wasn't really by design, actually. It just turned out that way. So I grew up loving painting, and I went to art school. I did a 5-year degree at art school. But during that time, I also started dabbling with music, and I got interested in cybernetics. So I remember being in a complete turmoil at art school about whether I was going to become a painter, whether I was going to do music, or whether I was actually going to leave the arts and go into the sciences. I had already some friends there who were cyberneticians. Stafford Beer was a friend of mine, for example. And one day, in a sort of shattering moment of enlightenment, I thought, why don't I just do them all? Kind of somehow find a way of mixing them all together. And that was a dream at that time, but it gradually became true. I started doing a kind of art that mixed music and visual arts and science, actually. So it sort of gradually worked its way out, but it's not something I could have designed in advance.
Right. So you avoided to make a choice, in other words, and
Exactly.
experimented with all of this. And do you connect 2, 3? I mean, is it like music plus technology? Is it visual arts plus music? Or how do you go about it?
Technology is often a part of it, because I think one of the most interesting things about technology is that it's generally produced for historical reasons, you know, because we want to do this job faster or that job more cheaply or something like that. So there's a historical, it's doing a job that exists, but improving it in some way. But nearly all technologies, as soon as they exist, they start to do things that nobody expected. And so it's not usually the technologists who notice that happening. It's usually artists who notice it first. So artists realize that you can now do something you couldn't ever do before because this technology existed. Well, artists are people who like doing things that you couldn't ever do before. So I always say that science discovers, but art digests. Science discovers things and shows you them, but it doesn't really give you any ideas about how you should feel about it or what you could do with it or how it makes the world different. And I think artists pick up on that pretty quickly.
Interesting.
I think artists are people who are interested in how the world is changing, right, in what's new that hasn't happened before, right, in what kinds of feelings you can now have that you couldn't have before.
So we talk a lot about augmentation today, job augmentation. You know, technology is going to allow us to do more than what we're doing today, particularly with Gen AI. But you're saying something different. You're saying we look at the technology as artists in a different ways in order to exploit possibilities that none of the technologies could have dreamt.
Could have dreamt of, yes. Well, a very good example from the music world is multi-track recording.
Right.
So I won't be too boring about this, but until about 1928, whole orchestras were recorded with one microphone. And sometimes it wasn't even a microphone. Before that, it was just a horn. And so in order to get the balance right, you would arrange the people around the microphone so the louder instruments were far away and the quieter ones, like the singer, were close up. That was single mic recording. Multiple mic recording happened not because anyone imagined making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but because they wanted to be able to separately balance things so that they didn't want to be forced to make all their decisions physically before the recording happened. So the next step after a single mic was 2 mics. And that meant if you had 2 singers, maybe you could put them on separate mics and you could adjust the balance as the performance was being made. That was all it was about. It was just about doing this historical job of getting a nicely balanced sound a little bit more easily. But it was only when people like Les Paul, the guitar player, realized that if you had more than one channel, you didn't have to record everything at the same time. You could record the first thing on Thursday, and then you come back on Friday and play another instrument next to it, and it would be in sync with it. So suddenly it changed recording from a process like performance to a process like painting. A painter doesn't have to do it all at once.
Right.
She can come back the next day and do it a little bit different, and she can take a bit off and then put something else back the next day. So it changed the process of making music into a process that had a different relationship with time than it had ever had in the past. Until multi-track recording was always about performance.
Right.
This thing happened at this moment, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's it. It's finished at that moment. As soon as you could start to work with more than one microphone, you could work in time. You weren't confined to one moment in time. So nobody really could have guessed this, and nobody did guess it until this, rather brilliant guitar player in the late 1940s suddenly realized that he could play 8 guitars on one song.
And then presumably that's what led to mixing machines and things like that in the background, right? So then with the technology built on each other.
And of course, then it led to the whole inflation of modern popular music, which is so much more complex than it ever could have been in the past.
Right.
And of course is made now empirically. You don't have to have the piece finished in your mind before you start. That's the other thing. In the past, you had to know what you were going to play.
Right.
You only got one chance.
Right.
And it had to be all right. Now you can do what I have always done my whole career, which is to go in and start something. I don't have any clue where it's going. And I start it and I listen to it and I try this and I try that. And then I ask someone else to come in and do something on top of it. And then I sit back and sometimes leave it for a few months, come back to it. It's an entirely different process.
Right.
Most people don't realize how different making music now is from their conception of how it's made.
Right.
Almost anything you hear is not made according to the traditional picture of how a recording is made.
Cool.
That's completely finished. Not completely, almost completely.
Almost completely finished. And presumably when you experiment like this, when you say, I try a few things, I add things, I dub things, I do all these kind of things that we do, there must be something that you go, wow, this is an interesting avenue, and things you go, ugh, this is not great. How do you manage that? I mean, is it just trial and error? You forget the bad and you move on with the good, or how does it work?
I have a very strong aversion to doing the same thing again.
Okay.
So if I find myself in the same place, what that means is having exactly the same feeling that I've had before, I think, I'm not really interested to be here. I always think there are two kinds of artists. Do you know that song from Oklahoma, I think it's called, The Farmer and the Cowboy Can't Be Friends?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I always like those two pictures. The farmer is the guy who gets a piece of land and really studies it and works it and understands it and really goes deep into it. And the cowboy is someone who always wants to go to new places and find new territories that nobody's ever been to before. I think I'm more cowboy than farmer somehow. But I find with a lot of artists fall into one of those two categories.
Right.
Some manage both, but I mean, Samuel Beckett is a very good example of a farmer. He wrote the same kind of books his whole life. Borges is another one, William Burroughs, another one. They're all kind of farmer types, though they may have been cowboys in the first place. Once they found their fields, they stayed on them.
But that's true for a lot of music nowadays, right? I mean, somebody has or books for that matter, or any other form of arts. Once, you find it is sometimes a format. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether it's the artist or whether it's a publisher or whether who's pushing, but the immediate thinking is replication.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I won't mention any names, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
That you hear album number 3 sounds exactly like album number 1,
yes.
virtually with different words. How do you avoid that? I mean, you're obviously very curious, but there's also the commercial side. Mm-hmm. How does that work?
Well, it's different for different people. I have never got myself into a hole commercially where I needed to owe a particular kind of record to anybody. If you take $1 million advance from a record company. They want to get their $1 million back. So if you don't want to be bound to them, you shouldn't take the advance in the first place.
Right.
And I often talk to younger musicians, and they're very excited because somebody has just offered them $5 million or something. And I said, well, that's fine, but you realize you will owe them $5 million. And they will get it back somehow or another. So you trade freedom for that. But I've never needed to do that, and I'm happy that I haven't. But also I think there are different kinds of artists. Some people actually flourish on obligation of that kind.
Right.
I mean, I have a friend who's a very well-known touring artist who says, if I didn't take huge advances, I would never get out of bed. So he puts himself in a position where he's obligated. It's a little bit like a writer signing a contract to say, I will finish a novel in 18 months' time, even though they might not have started. It's one way of working. I can't do that myself. I don't like being in debt.
Well, we do that in academia a lot, and we never finish in that. We miss the deadline. Yeah. But just, you said something once, I probably will get it wrong, but the words were kind of, the best songs are the one with deadlines and the smallest budget.
Yes.
Or small budget. Explain that to me.
Music technology keeps developing to the point where there's always far more alternatives than you imagined. Every week there are new pieces of software coming out. There are new things you could try. And it used to be the case about 50 years ago where you could go into a studio and there were sort of 6 toys that you could play with, and you could try them all out, and that's it, you've exhausted. So then you have to think about what you're going to do. There are now about 600,000 toys, and I'm not making that figure up. That's probably literally true. And so if you want to take that approach of saying, well, let's just try everything and see what works, you'll die before you finish the album. So the first thing that you have to do is to find ways of limiting your field of exploration, really. Right. You simply cannot explore the whole field. So if you want to finish something, find ways of doing it. And you can do that quite artificially by saying, I'm just not going to use anything in that half of the studio. Right. Or, as I do sometimes with people, I say, I'm going to tape all your fingers together so you can't play any big chords. Or you can say, you're only going to get to 8 minutes to write this piece. I do this sometimes with musicians as well. I say, let's try to write 10 pieces of music in an hour. And of course, it's a panic. And the funny thing is, in panic, people often do very interesting things. They do things that they wouldn't risk doing otherwise, because they can always blame the system. They can always say, well, I know it's stupid, but he asked me to do it. Yeah. Sometimes something comes out of that really makes you think, wow, I never would have done that if I'd had the choice. Right. You know, I would have cleaned it up or made it less like this or more like that. So I think deadlines produce that kind of effect. I had an instance with U2 once. I was working with them on the album Achtung Baby. And that was a really important record for all of us. It was really a complete break from what they'd been doing before. And it was a brave move for them to do. And I remember there was a point, I think it was about 2 weeks before we were due to deliver the album. And it had to be delivered then because they were then going on a tour that had already been booked, couldn't be cancelled, you know. And there were 2 weeks left, and we had about 38 songs on the go. None of them were finished. We weren't even sure which ones would go on the album. And everyone was panicking and freaking out. And I thought the only way to make this work is to go further in it. So I said, why don't we take a week's holiday? And everyone said, what now? We haven't got any time as it is. I said, why don't we do it? Take a week's holiday, not listen to any of the music while we're away. Just forget about it for a week. And I thought it was a dangerous strategy because it was sort of make or break, you know. Right. It could have failed. But what happened, in fact, was that after the week, everyone who went different places and came back, and suddenly so many things were completely obvious. that song's weak. That's no good at all. That one's really good, but we'll never finish it in time. Right. We'll save it for the next record. Suddenly everything sort of fell into place, and it was because the pressure was now so intense. There was no time for any excuses or...
so you think it's more the pressure, that the time limit that you had, than the time of reflection during the week holiday?
Yeah. I think the time of reflection just was a way of forgetting about it for a little while.
Right.
So you could walk back in. Sometimes if you haven't heard something for a few weeks, you walk back in and listen to it and you think, oh, it's obvious that the drums are wrong on that. Or it's obvious that such and such is the case. So that's one way of, I think, of getting something to happen. Another way that I think is sort of similar, but it's the other way round from that, is I remember reading a long, long time ago about a technique that Japanese calligraphers used. They would go out on the lake in the morning in their little boat, and then they would grind their inks. You know, you had to grind it from... And they would do it in the lake because then you didn't get any dust or anything into the ink. And they would spend most of the day doing that. This would be a single guy in a little coracle. And then as it's starting to get dusk, he comes back in and he goes... That's the picture done. So that long preparation where it seems like you're doing nothing or doing nothing important, what you're doing then really is thinking about what you're going to do. And I find this also a very interesting process to plant the seed of the thing in your mind and then not do it for quite a long time, to let it sit there and brew, let it, you're secretly, I call it secret thinking, because you're not really conscious of thinking about it, but it's finding a place somehow in your mind. And sometimes I like to do that as well, by setting in motion strange exercises.
So describe some, that'd be fun.
Well, the simplest one is, let's all change instruments. Which means you risk having me on the drums, which, and I am probably one of the world's worst drummers. So that always sets things up in a new way. But it's very interesting because sometimes people who can't play an instrument accidentally have brilliant ideas. You know, they do something that is so kind of outrageously stupid or simple that nobody would ever think of doing it. But it's just the right thing sometimes, you know. So that's one technique. Another one is using my cards, oblique strategies. Yeah. There's about 110 of them, and they each give you an instruction of some kind, and they're quite mysterious instructions. But I've often used those when I want to just push a session into a different place, so it doesn't become just, oh, here we are back in the studio, do the usual thing, plug the guitar in, set the amp to these settings, and you know, if you have an instruction that says breathe deeply, and you have to interpret that as a musical instruction, you have to think, what does that actually mean? Or you have another instruction which says do nothing or continue with immaculate consistency. So one track I did with David Bowie once, we were playing with these cards, we used them a lot, and we each took a card, and the game was to keep it secret.
All right.
Not to tell anyone, not to tell the other person what was on your card. His one, so we made this piece together. It's a lovely piece called Moss Garden. But it turned out his card said, continue with immaculate consistency, I think was his card. And mine was destroy the most important thing. So he's trying to build something, and I'm always trying to take away the thing that is holding it all together. And it was very funny making it, because the piece kept kind of blowing up and collapsing and blowing up and collapsing until it reached a point that neither of us would have ever found otherwise, I think. There's a certain point at which you say, hold on, this is actually really good. Yeah. Should we stop playing the game now?
But that's really interesting, because so we talk about small budget, timelines, constraints. We see that a lot also in the way people innovate. You know, you can give $1 million to a team and they'll come up with an average answer. Or you give $100 to somebody in a developing country,
Yeah.
they'll come up with the most amazing solution
Yeah.
because the constraints force them to think
Yeah.
sort of outside the box. It feels like that's kind of what you're trying to get people out of their knowledge and learning, or the system they've learned at least. Because as a guitarist, you'll know, okay, should I try, these 3 chords or something? And you're saying, no, let's push out of your system. That's your example about changing instruments, for
Yes.
instance.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the process you're trying to establish? So get them out of what they actually know?
I think that people are at their most creative when they're most alert. That's to say, when they're really listening and they're ready to pick up on things that are probably just beginning to form. To make people alert, you put them in a slightly dangerous situation, in a situation that they're not completely comfortable with, because nobody likes to fail.
Right.
So if you're in a situation which is unfamiliar, you're looking for ways of making it work.
Right.
You're very alert. The absolute opposite of that is the sort of lazy sessions player. There are some lazy sessions players who just come in and do the same thing on every session, basically. Right. That's their thing. And that's fine. They're like paint. They just cover a hole in the music. But if you want new things to happen, you have to create new situations in which they can happen, I think. And I think there are lots and lots of ways of doing that, particularly if you're working with a group of people, because there are so many interesting dynamics of... Right. I was working with a band once that had 7 players in it. So I was thinking, how many groups could you have within 7 players? So one group would be those 2 players, another group is those 2 players, another group is those 3 players, another group is those 5 players, another group is those players. It's 128 groups, right, it turns out. And so I thought, that's really interesting, because they always all play together. That's natural if you're an improvising group. It's only orchestral players who don't all play all at the same time. All of us who come out of jazz and pop and folk and so on, the expectation is that you will always be doing something. And it's a big moment in jazz, for instance, when other people stop and you have the bass solo that nobody can ever hear. Right. I don't know why they bother with them, but the bass player does all this work and everybody else is sort of looking around wondering when the break is. Anyway, the point is that I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to, before we start working on a piece, we'll just pick a number between 1 and 128, and that's the group we'll be. So you might get 1 vocalist, a keyboard player, and the roadie as the band. Depends, who you include in the initial catchment. But then working within a piece, you'd say, okay, so let's have group 62 for the first part, and then something changes here and we're group 11. I mean, it's just a way of trying to create alertness, trying to create a condition where you're not comfortable and you're not going to make the same decisions you did last time.
Right.
But of course, we all are drawn to certain musical ideas and certain feelings, and we will want to make them, and there's no reason we shouldn't. But I like to destabilize the situation a bit so that it doesn't slip down the same road each time.
Maybe I'd like to go back to the technology side, because you have the benefit, like me, of having seen technology evolve over the years, from the reel to reel, I think, to what we have today, like Gen AI, which is fabulous. Do you see so first of all, how do you see those changes influencing art and music and other visual expressions? And in particular, maybe if we finish talking a little bit about Gen AI, because there are 2 views on Gen AI, that it's, wow, this thing is really creative, and other people say, no, actually, this is really dumb from a creative perspective, because all it does is replicating exactly what we've done in the past, right? Where do you stand? Because you've seen the evolution of many technologies, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so the first thing to say is that of all the arts, music in particular has always been very technological. People think the grand piano is not technology. It's the most incredibly complex piece of technology you can imagine, actually. And it's still evolving after 300 years. So there have been huge revolutions in music caused by a change in the technology. For instance, when Steinway brought in the third pedal, which meant that you could sustain one chord and then play staccato over it. And then suddenly all this new music came out of Debussy and Ravel and so on, based on that simple innovation. And so that's always been going on in music, that there's always been an interplay between what was technically possible, usually, as I said, for historical reasons, to solve an old problem, but then people finding, oh, you can do something really interesting with this that we could never do before. We never even thought of doing. Now, of course, in the electronic era, that has accelerated hugely. There is so much. I can't keep up with it now.
Right.
I probably was one of the last people who had a kind of view of the whole field. I remember when I lived in New York, which was in the 70s, a man died who had been the only person in America who actually understood the whole of American tax law. He was an old man by then, but he had kept up with it. And he'd been there right at the beginning of the evolution of American income tax law, which started in 1920 or something like that.
Not somebody you want to take on holiday, right?
He probably needed a holiday, actually. But he was the last remaining person who had an overview of the whole area.
Right.
And who could know how that was connected to that and so on. And similarly, in the same, I think it was the same month, a man who was the head of translation at the United Nations died, and he could speak 54 languages.
Wow.
After that, they never bothered trying to find these generalists any longer. That wasn't possible. So I think I was probably one of the last people who understood the whole field,
right,
up until about 12 years ago. Now I don't, and I don't think anybody else does. The younger people won't have the grasp of the older stuff.
Right.
And the older people won't have the grasp of the new stuff.
Yes, and why is that? Because the technology is evolving so fast, and your point earlier on about there's probably 6,000 or 600 different ways of producing music or art, I think. Is that the reason? Or?
Yeah, it's evolving very quickly, but also it's also evolving to do different things. I mean, one of the things that happened with the evolution of the very simple technology of the record player, or the record itself, if you like, was that suddenly music was no longer linked to place. I'd said earlier that it was no longer linked to time,
mm-hmm,
but it was also not linked to place, because you could take a record and play it anywhere.
Right.
So it didn't belong in a concert hall or in a room with particular acoustics or anything like that. You could play it anywhere you liked, and you could play it 1,000 times if you liked.
Yeah.
I remember when I bought the first Beatles album that I bought, I just played it over and over until my parents went nearly mad. Now, that was something that nobody could do in the past.
Right.
This notion of total repetition. I remember reading an interview with a man who died in the late 19th century, who described the thrill of having seen Beethoven's Sixth Symphony 7 times in his life. It was a big deal that he'd seen it 7 times. Well, nowadays you could see it 700 times on your... So that was one of the things. Music became a different art form, and it meant that it could pop up in different places. You have special music for listening to in cars.
Right.
You have cars that are designed to be good for listening to music in. So all the time there's this sort of symbiosis between an art form and the culture it's in, where they keep geeing each other on. You talked about AI. Well, to me, that isn't quite so problematic to imagine as a creative tool as it is for some people. You're quite right in saying that it simply repackages what's already around. Right. And indeed, if you use most of the creative tools now, you very quickly become aware of that. They at first they're amazing. You think, bloody hell, that really sounds like a song.
Yeah.
And then after you've done that about 20 times, you think, oh, that's another song. And you start to realize that it is a sort of, at the moment, it's a sort of averaging process.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the challenge becomes, so how do you stop it doing that? What do you tell it? What do you forbid it from hearing? How do you train it, essentially? And then it becomes very interesting because, you know, every musician is used to the idea of working with what technology can do.
Right.
For instance, even a simple thing like reverb or echo, you know, suddenly this bonk becomes boo, and there's a little world there, you know. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're building new worlds all the time. And as soon as you realize that, oh, I've just heard something that didn't exist before, then you're on to making something new. And I've been working with AI for a while now, and just starting to learn how to fool it.
Right.
How to stop it being drawn by this huge magnet with the word kitsch written all over it.
Right.
That's what AI wants you to do. That's what it's all set up to do, because most of the people who design AI are interested in replication. They want to make something that sounds like a hit pop song.
Right.
Which, of course, is a completely boring project. It's only technically interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it means you can then say, hey, I've made something that makes really boring pop songs.
But it's going back really to the point you made, right? That the people who design, particularly Gen AI, are not artists or are not creators or are not musicians, or they tend to be technologists. So
Yes.
they do something that works really well for replication, that you still a human as to dictate the questions and things like that. So I'm intrigued about whether you know anyone that's really pushing. You mentioned training, for instance. You can train those same engine technical in very different ways with some different sources of learning, if you want. Do you know anyone is actually doing that to move away from this sort of blancmange, solution that you get most of the time?
Well, I am.
Okay, you are.
And one or two, I know a few people who are doing it, who are realizing that what you have to do is use your skills as an artist to create limitations on the system. You have to stop it going, you know, it's this huge attractor that wants you to go in a certain direction.
Right.
That wants you to write poems that are like Hallmark cards, that wants you to write music that sounds like the worst top 40 radio. Of course it's going to want you to do that, because that's where most of the stuff it is drawing on. So there are two ways of doing that. Either you filter the inputs so that it isn't drawing on everything in the world, but it's drawing on a set that you've chosen for it, which might include your own inputs as well. That's what I've been experimenting with a little bit.
Okay. So this is, just so I understand, so this is you basically customize the training to what you, okay.
In a very crude sense. I mean, that makes it sound like I'm doing something much more clever than I'm really doing. but that's the direction I want to go in. The other thing you can do is then really filter the output.
Right.
That's, to me, where the artistry comes in.
Okay.
Because it can produce endlessly large amounts of stuff. So you have to think of ways of picking your way through that.
Help me with the filtering. So this is telling the machine or the AI what you do not want, or?
Yeah, that doesn't, the machines usually ignore that. Like I often say, no drums. Sorry, no insult to you. I know you're a drummer, but it's not because I don't like drummers. It's because as soon as there are drums, then it fits in all the other bits. Oh, so there's got to be a bass, and there's got to be a guitar, and there's got to be. So one of the ways of fooling it is by taking away one of the things it always builds around.
Okay.
Saying you can't have that one. Another one is, it's very hard to get it to do, is to say, please play arrhythmically, or ignore, don't put a pulse throughout the piece. And what typically happens is very funny. It'll start out, and then after about 10 seconds, it'll go, I can't take this. And it'll go, boom, 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 boom. You can feel the agony of the AI as it's forced to do this stuff that doesn't sound like anything on the top 40. And finally it breaks down. But more seriously about AI, what I'm worried about with it is not what it can do,
right,
but who owns it.
Right.
That is a really serious issue, because we'll get a replica of what happened with social media, with everything else. As soon as it's run with profit as the main objective,
Right.
you will get the worst results. And I can sort of see us on our way to going there. It's absolutely ridiculous and scandalous that it isn't available to public input.
Right.
You know, we keep doing this thing, technology, because it's so profit driven, of building these really fast cars, but forgetting to put any brakes in them.
Right.
You know, and brakes, in my opinion, is some kind of social overview of what the value and use and dangers of these things are.
Right.
So it's like, wow, I've built this really fast car. It can go 700 miles an hour. No, of course I didn't put any brakes in.
Yeah. Which is kind of where we are with AI, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly where we are.
I'm going to change the subject because I know you're going to get angry if we carry on.
You can tell, can't I? The number of swear words is going up.
I'm going to switch to talking very briefly to conclude about Brian Eno, and two questions for you. One is, I've read over the years a lot of people saying who are your role models, and a lot of people saying Brian Eno. So I'd like to know who you would name as some of your role models throughout your careers with an S. And then second, what's the next project for Brian Eno? Because you've been switching from one to the other, hundreds of times over your career. So
one day I'll find out.
Yeah, or maybe you don't know. I don't know.
What my job really is. Well, I was very lucky to have met some really interesting people. I think my first role model was my uncle, who was an eccentric, very eccentric guy who'd ended up in India for 10 years in the 1930s as a soldier initially, but he fell off his horse, got concussion, and he was discharged from the army, and he just liked being in India, so he stayed around for a while and got into a sort of guru thing. And then he came back to England and was the town gardener for the rest of his working life. And he was a watercolor painter and an artist, and he really liked me and talked to me about art.
Right.
And I came from a working class family, and I don't think anybody else would have talked about that. So I got interested in the idea of making things. I loved the thought that you could make something that never existed before. So he was important to me. Then the second person who was really important to me was the mother of one of my first girlfriends. She had no formal higher education, but she'd got very interested in the work of Karl Popper, the logician of science. And she liked me too, and she invited me to be part of her circle. I was 17 at the time, and other people in the circle were Francis Crick, John Kendrew, quite a few scientists, and me, 17. And she said to me one day, she was very posh, she said, "Brian, what always bothers me, I mean, it's very nice having you here, but I often wonder why somebody with a good mind like yours would waste it being an artist." And that was such a provocation to me. And I thought, am I wasting it? And then I started thinking about that question. What does art actually do? Why does one want to be an artist? What does it do for the world? So that was a big question for me, and that I still think about it. I think about Joan's question every day.
Okay.
In some way or another. I'll just mention one other because he was an important person for me. It was the cybernetician Stafford Beer, who was a very charismatic and strange man with the largest beard I've ever seen. Came down to about here. And he was the person who tried to link the idea of cybernetics to the idea of governance, social governance. And that became very important to me. That was another thread that I still touch every day, I guess. So I won't talk about any of the others because there's so many people.
So many.
Yeah.
And one idea on the next project?
I started with a few other people, this group called Hard Art. And we meet at my studio every couple of weeks, groups getting bigger and bigger. And it was based on this notion I had of coalescence. That's what I call it. So I've been involved in activism for a while now, and I read a lot, and I read New Scientist, and I read The Jacobin, and all sorts of different magazines. And what strikes me as most incredible is that there is so much going on. The biggest social movement the world has ever seen is happening now, and most of us don't know about it, even those of us who are in it. I had just read this book when I had this idea by Sergei Yurchak called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. It's a book about the end of the Soviet Union, and he talks about that happening, and he says the most extraordinary thing about it was that it happened overnight.
Right.
One day it was communist, the next day it wasn't, and the world didn't collapse. So the book is really about that process of how humans change direction and why it doesn't have to be catastrophic. And the answer is because they've already been changing for quite a long time anyway. But there's just one moment when they suddenly realize. And anyway, there's a sentence in that book where he says, revolutions come in two phases. The first phase is where everybody realizes that it's all gone wrong. The second phase is when everybody realizes that everybody else realizes it as well. So my idea with hard art was to create a group of people from all sorts of disciplines. I mean, it really is quite broad. We have, apart from the usual suspects like artists and academics and activists, we have people from the military, people from the faiths, doctors. It's a complete mess of people. And it's sort of saying to each other, oh, you've noticed it as well. How does it manifest in your world? This is how it manifests in my world. And we're trying to create this kind of coalescence where people suddenly look around and say, oh, yeah, we're not the minority. It's not us, a few nutcases outside the system. We are it. We are the system.
Amazing.
That's my new project.
Very good. Brian, it's been really a pleasure to have you at IMD. We really enjoy your company.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.